Good morning. It's good to see those of you who have made your plans to be with us for our Sunday morning service here at the South Bend Church of Christ. Thank you, Brother Michael, for the prayers on my behalf. Thank you for Brother David for the songs that you chose this morning. It kind of helped set the stage for our thoughts. I'm excited to bring a portion of God's Word to you this morning. Before I do that, though, I would be remiss if I did not take this opportunity for a very heartfelt and sincere thank you to the congregation. The last month or so has been a long month in the Fuller household, with Quaid breaking his leg and just dealing with all of that and going from a very busy, mobile toddler to a unhappy, immobile toddler has been tough. But the prayers, the cards, the presents, the visits, the food, all of that has made our lives so much easier. Sheridan and I countless times have stopped and looked at each other and wondered out loud how we would be able to do this without our church family, and we're so glad that we don't have to find out the answer to that. So thank you all. It's fitting that I started by talking about Quaid this morning. This morning I wanted to talk about something that has been very present on my mind for the last 3 years or so, and that's the topic of fatherhood. I'm sure that the fact that that's been on my mind is not a surprise to anybody here. You see our family and hear our family every church service, and we appreciate your patience with us through that. But the topic of fatherhood is something that's very important. And, we know biblically the importance of a father-child relationship and the way that God uses that relationship to explain his love for us and mirror that father-child relationship with us. But the world also recognizes the importance of fatherhood. As I was putting this sermon together, I came across a website called the Fatherhood Project, and they did a bunch of meta-analyses and put together a lot of data about fatherhood and looked at the outcomes of children that didn't have a present father. And this is not an exhaustive list by any means of the negative impacts that can come from not having a present father, but it is a list that they put together. So the first thing is feelings of abandonment. If a father has chosen not to be in his children's lives as a child grows up, that manifests in feelings of abandonment in those children. It also manifests in behavioral problems at a higher rate than those people that have present fathers. And throughout their lives, those behavioral problems turn into delinquency and crime. The Fatherhood Project said that of all people that will be incarcerated at some point before their 18th birthday, 85% of those people came from fatherless households. Also leads to higher rates of teen promiscuity and teen pregnancy. Not having a present father led to higher rates of homelessness. Of all the individuals that will spend some time homeless before their 18th birthday, 90% came from fatherless households. Also leads to higher rates of drug and alcohol abuse, and all of these things together contribute to poor life outcomes for those that don't have a present father. So it's more likely for someone to pass away before their 18th birthday if their father isn't present, and then over the course of their life, people that grow up without a father have about a 4-year shorter life expectancy on average. So the secular world recognizes the importance of that father-child relationship dynamic being present in the household. But unfortunately, we're not doing anything to to combat that rate of fatherlessness, if you'll allow me to use that term. According to Pew Research Center in 1960, about 11% of households qualified into this category, didn't have a present father. But by 2023, that number had more than doubled. So a couple of years ago, we were looking at about 25% or 1 in 4 households. So we recognize that it's important, but we're not aligning our behaviors as a society in a way that agrees with that. And so whenever I think about fatherhood as a whole, I don't think that there's maybe a more appropriate job that falls under the category of an on-the-job training type of a job. I remember as we were expecting Quade and found out that Sheridan was pregnant, I remember Sheridan reading a lot of books and us talking about those books that she was reading. We had a plan, it seemed like, for every aspect of Quade's life. We had a plan and we're intentional about. And then you go to the hospital and they just give you a baby, and they don't ask you what that plan was. They don't assume that you did all of that. They just hand you a baby and say, go. And so, those first couple of weeks, you are in the midst of on-job training. Those first few days, it went by both really fast and really slow for us. But on-the-job training is a very effective instruction method, and that's why at the end of those first 2 or 3 days, you start to really feel like you've got a handle on things, is because you're kind of thrown into the fire. According to HRDI, which is a human resources research type company, on-the-job training leads to increased learning motivation and learning performance. So the way that our minds work, we're better off learning something if we can get in there and do it ourselves. And as I was thinking about this sermon and thinking about what I wanted to talk about, I decided early on I wanted to talk about Abraham and Isaac. It's been one of my favorite stories since I was little, and that's what I wanted to talk about. And so, but one of the things that has always that I've always struggled with that story on is why God asked Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. And so, as I was thinking about fatherhood and on-the-job training, it occurred to me that Abraham kind of went through on-the-job training for us. God was going to offer his son for us. And so, where I had started with my thought of why Abraham asked Isaac, or why God asked Abraham to offer Isaac, was that God wanted us to go through what he would go through. God wanted us to understand and to experience for ourselves firsthand what he would go through in offering Jesus, because God understands the way that we learn. He knows that going through something and learning by experience is the way that we learn. And God understood what he was asking of Abraham, because that is what Abraham was modeling, what God would do for us. And as I studied and as I went through the sermon, I challenged that assertion, and that's not exactly where I landed with it, and we'll see that as we go throughout. So as kind of an outline this morning, first we'll look at Abram and Sarai, as they're named when we meet them. And we'll look at their early lives and look at their journey, and ultimately the birth of their son Isaac. And we'll look at what little the Bible tells us about Isaac's early life. And then we'll look at the story of Abraham being called to offer Isaac. And we'll look at the lessons that we can learn from that story. So first we'll look at Abraham and Sarah. And once their names are changed to Abraham and Sarah, they're given kind of the monikers, or those names mean father and mother or princess of many nations. And that is a representation of the promise that God will make to Abram. So Michael actually talked about Ur of the Chaldeans on Wednesday and talked about that being the birthplace of Abram, and that's exactly right. He was born in Ur of the Chaldeans, and both Abram and Sarai's father was Terah, and he was a Babylonian high priest, and we read about him in Joshua chapter 24, verse 2. Joshua said to all the people, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Long ago, your ancestors, including Terah, the father of Abraham and Nahor, lived beyond the Euphrates River and worshipped other gods." So as a high priest, Terah's job was to fabricate and sell idols. And, the Bible doesn't directly tell us this, but as was common in that day, young men grew up and typically would work in the profession of their fathers. So it's likely that Abram's first job was helping fabricate and sell these idols with his father. So Abram grows up and marries Sarai, and Terah's life continues. And towards the end of Terah's life, he decides to move his family up north to kind of the southern Turkey area, present-day Turkey, to Haran. And Abram and Sarai, Sarai's barren, it tells us, and so they don't have a family of their own, so they decide, or children of their own, I should say. So they decide to go with the family up to Haran, and they move up there, and this happens whenever Abram's about 45 years old. And so they move up there, and then about 5 years later, Terah passes away, and then this is when Abram is called by God to go to the land of Canaan for the first time. So this is about Genesis 12 is whenever this happens. So Genesis chapter 12, verse 1, the Bible says, "The Lord God said to Abram, 'Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you.'" So immediately following that call to go to the land of Canaan, God explains why and explains what's waiting for Abram there. And this is the first time that the covenant promises are made to Abram. We see that immediately following in Genesis 12, verse 2. "I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." So, we see three promises made to Abram here. The first is his offspring and being made a great nation. The second is the promised land, the land of Canaan. That's where, like I said, that's where God has called Abram to go. And then finally, protection. He will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And so Abram, as we'll see kind of as a theme in his life, whenever Abram's called to do something, he does it. Whether it's something he's excited about doing or not, he immediately goes and does it. And so Abram loads up his household and what's left of his father's house and begins heading towards Canaan. But on their way, there's a great famine in the land that causes them to divert to Egypt, where there's a little bit more food. And we see that recorded for us in Genesis chapter 12, verse 10. "Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe." So Abram goes down to Egypt and spends some time there. And these are very, very broad brushes that I'm painting with. There's probably a series of sermons that I could do just based on the high points that I'm not hitting in Abram and Sarai's life. But they leave up through Egypt, and then God has the covenant of circumcision with Abram. So at this point in Abram's life, he's 99 years old. So it's been about 45 years since the initial promises have been made to Abram. And in that interim, there's been some distrust on Abram and Sarai's part. They've tried to take those promises into their own hands. But here God is reasserting those promises, and he changes Abram's and Sarai's name to Abraham and Sarah, and reasserts that they will be the father and mother of many nations. Reiterates all of the previous promises that were made in Genesis 12. And then he also establishes this physical manifestation for God to set aside his people. Up until this point, God's relationship with his people was spiritual and not anything physical. And with circumcision, God is physically marking and setting aside his people. And then also, God reaffirms the promise that not only will it be Abraham's son, but it will be Abraham and Sarah's son. So the promise will be fulfilled through Sarah, not just through Abraham. And that the fulfillment of that promise is Isaac. And Isaac is given the moniker, the name, the master of suffering, because of the story that we'll read and talk about this morning. Like I mentioned earlier, there's not much that we know about Isaac's life before his attempted sacrifice. We do know that he was born during Abraham's 100th year, and that's recorded for us in Genesis chapter 21 and verse 5. And so right off the bat, this is not a traditional young woman, young man, and then their baby. We're talking about someone that's 100 years old having a newborn. But that wasn't the only way that Isaac's family situation was unique. One of the high points that I didn't talk about with Abram and Sarai, or didn't go into a lot of detail, was their distrust and them trying to take God's promise into their own hands. But that's a story that I would imagine we're all familiar with. Sarai had a handmaid named Hagar that the promise at that point, as they understood it, was that it would just be through Abraham's lineage. And so Sarai gave Hagar to Abraham, or to Abram, and they together conceived Ishmael. And so in addition to Isaac having some pretty elderly parents, he also had a stepbrother, an older stepbrother, and Hagar as well was in the picture here. And it didn't take long for that to cause issues and to cause conflict. We see in Genesis chapter 21, verse 8, the story of Isaac's Feast of the Weaning, which is a ceremony that took place at around 2 to 3 years of age that celebrated the transition to solid food. But Ishmael was laughing at Isaac there at that ceremony, and that displeased Sarah, and she asked for Abraham to send away Ishmael and Hagar, and he did, and then we know that God took care of Ishmael and Hagar in the wilderness. But that is really the bulk of the information that we have about Isaac prior to his attempted sacrifice. So in Jewish history, this event is called the Akedah, or the binding, because of Isaac being bound and placed on that altar. So we'll go ahead and read the story. It takes place in Genesis chapter 22, Genesis 22, and we'll start reading in verse 1. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. I mentioned that Abraham isn't the type to procrastinate or delay. I would imagine that this is, out of all the things that Abraham could have been called to do, this would be the last on his list. If there were ever something to procrastinate, it would be this. But we see in verse 3 there that Abraham arose early the next morning. He didn't put it off. He didn't hit snooze on that alarm, knowing what he had in store for him that day. Continue in verse 3. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father?" "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the two of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. Verse 13, Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. And to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me. Then Abraham returned to his servants, and they sat off together for Beersheba. And Abraham stayed in Beersheba. So first I'd like to look at Abraham's perspective and look at what we can glean from Abraham's perspective. This morning, if you would, I'd like for everybody to think of what they consider to be their prized possession. You know, it might be a car, it might be a house. If you're a child, it might be a favorite toy. But think of your prized possession. There are a few elements that we probably all have in common whenever we think of our prized possessions. One is that that's something that we really wanted, something that we longed for, that we probably worked towards. If you're like me, it's something that you read all the reviews of and get really excited about before you have it. And then it's also something that you probably take really good care of once you do have it. Something that because you've wanted it for so long that you see the value in maintaining. And growing up for us, this would probably be our family's prized possession. You can't really see it very well, but there are some shoes down at the base of that boat because we weren't allowed to wear shoes in the boat. We took really, really good care of that boat. Dad's inside the boat. This was right before we sold it, actually. But whenever you were getting on the boat and on the dock, you had to take your flip-flops off and burn your feet because you were not going to step your flip-flop onto the upholstery of that boat. And, I didn't like taking friends to the lake with me because I would have to explain to them that whenever that boat comes out of the water, we're not going back and having s'mores. We're going to grab some microfiber towels and a cleaning solution, and we are going to wipe down every inch of that boat so there's no water spots on it. And so it was certainly something that we took really good care of. It was also something that I remember really longing after, really wanting. Whenever my family first started going down to the lake, I was probably 6 or 7 years old. We were using my grandparents' place at the lake, and we're staying there and using their boat. And it was an older kind of ski boat. And I remember whenever our family started talking about buying a boat of our own, I remember going to the showroom and seeing it and thinking about what it would be like to have that boat and what it'd be like to have it on the water. And so that boat was our prized possession. So in addition to prized possessions, those of you that are parents this morning, I'd like for you to also think about the moment you became a parent. So the moment that you held your oldest child for the first time. Think about all the feelings that were running through your mind, the nervousness, all the reading that you'd done, and all of those emotions that are bound up in holding your first child. Whenever we think about Abraham, Isaac was his most prized possession. It checks all the boxes. Abraham, whenever we meet him in Genesis chapter 11, I believe it's 2 sentences after he's introduced for the first time, it's mentioned that his wife Sarai was barren. And that tells me that having a child and being a father is something that Abraham really longed after, that he spent a lot of time wanting. And he wanted that for 100 years before he had that fulfillment through Sarah that he was looking for. And we won't ever want anything for 100 years. Most of us probably won't make it to 100. So the level of desire to be a father that Abraham had, bound up and combined with the fact that it was his child. So all of those feelings that we feel holding our child were just as bound up in Isaac. But then there's even one further step, which is that Isaac was the physical representation of the fulfillment of all of those promises that had been made to him. 45 years ago, whenever Abraham packed up all of his things and left Haran for Canaan, everything had been pointing forward toward Isaac and towards Isaac being the fulfillment of that. So it's honestly hard for me to even imagine how Abraham viewed Isaac. If we could put ourselves in Abraham's shoes looking at Isaac, everything that he meant to Abraham. And God knew that, but that's what God asked for. That's what God asked of Abraham, was the one thing that Abraham couldn't do without. And that's true for us as well. Fully committing to God requires us to not hold anything back. We can't give 99.9%, we have to give 100. We see in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 22, you were taught with regard to your former way of life to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires, to be made new in the attitude of your minds, and to put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. God expects that from us. He expects that full commitment from us because that's what God did for us. We see in Romans chapter 8, verse 32, he who did not spare his son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? In John chapter 3, verse 16, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. That's the kind of full commitment that God gave to us and the kind of full commitment he expects in return. So now let's look at what we can learn from Isaac and how he parallels and is a foreshadow of Jesus. The first parallel that came to mind is the location that these two stories take place in. The land of Moriah that we read about in Genesis is the same region and the same mountain range that Calvary would have been in. There are some scholars that think that those were the exact same mountain. Regardless of whether that's the case or not, they were certainly close to each other geographically, and so that's the first parallel. Secondly, I found this really interesting. Both involved a mountain, so there was an upward or uphill journey involved in both, but also both of the sacrifices carried the instruments of their sacrifice up the hill. So Jesus carried the cross, but Isaac, the wood for the altar was loaded on Isaac. The third element that parallels the two of them is the element of submission on the behalf of the sacrifice. This is something that, of course, makes sense with Jesus. Jesus famously prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane, not my will, but yours. We sing the song, he could have called 10,000 angels, and that's certainly true. Jesus being on that cross was an act of submission. He was submitting to God's will, submitting to God's plan for us. But as I read through this story, it dawned on me that Isaac was every bit as complicit in his sacrifice as Jesus was. And my reason for asserting that is whenever Isaac was born, Abraham was 100 years old. There's no definitive age that Isaac was whenever this took place. I've seen everything from about 13 to early 20s. And so, post-pubescent to early 20s. But what I realize is that Isaac could have halted this at any point. Isaac was, as a young man, would have been able to overpower his father and would have been able to prevent that sacrifice from getting to that point if he wanted to. And so there was certainly an element of submission present in both. And then lastly, there's an element of resurrection. Obviously, Jesus was resurrected, never to die again. But we read this morning that Abraham considered Isaac to be raised from the dead. And the reason why, I believe, is that if you read the story in Genesis as we did, the language is that I believe Abraham chose to drive that knife down before he was stopped. So to Abraham, he made the decision to offer Isaac. And at that point, Isaac was gone. And so we see the end of our reading from this morning in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 19. Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead, and so in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. So as we move through this story and think about what we can learn from it, hopefully the parallels between the story of God and him sacrificing Jesus for us and Abraham and Isaac, hopefully we've made those clear this morning. Abraham represents God and Isaac represents Jesus. But the moment at which Abraham decides to drive that knife down, the metaphor changes a little bit. A third element is introduced, and that's the ram that's caught. So Abraham still represents God the Father, but that ram now becomes Jesus. The substitute is Jesus. And there is even, I read some things that paralleled, Jesus wore a crown of thorns while he was on the cross. The ram is caught by its horns in a thicket, so caught by thorns, kind of a crown of thorns imagery there. And then Isaac, as the one who is saved from that altar, saved from being that sacrifice, represents us. And, as I mentioned and was thinking about why Abraham was called to do this, I've thought a lot lately over the last month about a child in pain. For those that, excuse me, for those that don't know the story, about a month ago or so, we had dinner, and while we were eating dinner, Quaid wanted to go to the park, and so we told him we'd do that, and so he finished up dinner, and it was time for Tate to go down, so Sheridan stayed at the house and put Tate to bed, and so I took Quaid by myself to the park, and we got there, and the first thing he wanted to do was swing. And he's starting to get to that age. He just had his second birthday, so he's starting to get to the age where he wants to do the big boy version of everything. So he wanted to do the big boy swing, and so we put him on the big boy swing, and that was great until he decided he wanted to get off the big boy swing, and he basically didn't give me enough time to get around and get him off before he kind of jumped himself. And whenever he fell, his right leg was kind of caught up on the seat, and so for a moment, all of his weight was suspended on that right thigh, and so he broke his femur. And whenever he fell off of that swing, he was crying before he hit the ground. And it's that, again, for the parents out there, it's that hurt cry that just makes you sick. And I will never forget scooping him up and, realizing that I was the only one that could have prevented that. It was an accident. I didn't put him on that swing intending for him to get hurt, but I was the one that could have prevented that. And I owned that, and it made me sick. And even though, like I said, it was an accident, I didn't put him up there with the intention of him getting hurt. I didn't think that he would get hurt whenever I put him up there. But he did. And thinking about that has made me realize that God knew. Whenever he sent his son down to this earth, he knew exactly what he would go through. He knew that he would be mocked, he would be beaten, he would be tortured, he would be crucified. And God did that anyway. And, whenever I started putting the sermon together, the human element of my understanding was, if I were God, I would want humanity to know what I'm doing for them. I'd want them to have an example of just to fully understand and appreciate what I'm doing. I need to have them experience it. But what I realize, I don't think that's the point of the story of Abraham and Isaac. The point is that God's love for us trumps that. God knew what he would be asking of his son, knew the way that he would be treated, but his love for us trumps all of that. And, we talked this morning about a father's love and about how important that is. And because we're in a broken world, not everybody gets to experience that from an earthly perspective, but I believe everyone should. And we have a heavenly Father and a way to experience that love on a deeper level than we can here, on a spiritual level that surpasses all of our understanding. And we all have an opportunity to be a part of that. We have an opportunity to be a part of that family and experience that father-child relationship dynamic. And if there's one this morning who's here that hasn't experienced that, you can. We have the baptistry ready. We have the ability to baptize you, to take your confession, baptize you into that family so that you can experience that love. If you're already a member of that family and you need the prayers of the church, I will be the first one to attest that this is an incredibly powerful church family whenever it comes to prayer, and they will lift you up and will support you if that's what you need. If there's one in either case, we ask that you would please come forward and have a seat on the front as we stand and sing the song that's been selected.